Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty big. We're talking U.S. tariffs and the whole thing with European steel and aluminum.
Yeah, this is not exactly new territory, right? We've seen this kind of back and forth before.
Exactly, like flashback to the Trump era, right? But even though it might feel like a rerun, the stakes are seriously high.
Hmm.
We're not just talking about a little trade spat here. This could have ripple effects across the globe.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about economics either. You've got national security concerns tangled up in it, the whole U.S.-China dynamic.
Yeah, there's so many layers here. So, for our listeners, let's try to untangle this web, starting with the basics.
Sounds good.
So, from the U.S. perspective, the tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, they're all about protecting American jobs and industries,
Mm,
right? At least that's the official line.
right.
The idea is to make those foreign goods more expensive so people buy American-made instead.
Classic protectionism.
Exactly. We're talking a 25% tariff, which is no small potatoes. And it's not just the EU in the crosshairs here. The UK and Japan are feeling the heat, too.
Right, and what's interesting is this whole protectionist approach. It's a tried and tested tactic, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword, isn't it?
How so?
Well, yeah, think about it. Let's say you're a small business owner in the U.S. and you need steel to make your product.
Right.
Suddenly, your costs skyrocket because of these tariffs. So you're either looking at squeezed profit margins or having to pass those costs on to your customers. Not ideal.
Definitely not. And that brings us to the EU's response. Let's just say they're not taking this lying down. The EU's called their approach firm and proportionate, which basically means they're ready to fight fire with fire.
And they've got a track record, right?
Well, yeah. Remember a few years back when they hit back with tariffs on things like Harley-Davidsons, American blue jeans, and even bourbon?
It was symbolic and strategic.
Totally. It was a message. And it looks like they're gearing up for a similar counterpunch this time.
Yeah, and the EU's concerns are valid. They're worried these tariffs will hurt businesses and consumers on both sides of the Atlantic, driving up prices and disrupting the whole global trade system.
Right. Like nobody wins in a trade war.
Exactly.
But we can't ignore the elephant in the room.
Which is?
China. The U.S. has been pointing the finger at China, accusing them of flooding the market with cheap steel. They call it non-market overcapacity.
Basically, China's pumping out way more steel than the world needs, and it's throwing things out of whack. Their state-subsidized industry is making it really tough for other countries to compete.
So do you think this whole situation might actually push the U.S. and the EU to team up against China on this?
It's definitely a possibility. Facing a common challenge like this, could we see a united front? Interesting to think about.
For sure. Okay, so to recap, the U.S. is slapping on tariffs, the EU is getting ready to hit back, and China's kind of like the big question mark hanging over everything.
And this all gets to a really fundamental question for the global economy. We live in a world that's more interconnected than ever.
Totally.
So how do countries balance looking out for their own interests with the need to keep the global trade system stable and functioning?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And I don't think there are any easy answers.
Right.
But it's a conversation we need to be having. So to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on all of this? How do we balance protectionism with globalization?
Leave a comment and let us know.
And make sure you subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives like this. We'll see you in the next one.